Welcome to the Hello FirstName podcast. The Hello FirstName podcast revolves around the term personalization and is brought to you by marketing author Rasmus Holing, founder of Omnichannel Institute and Chief Experience Officer at the marketing automation software company Agilic. The podcast is based on the book Hello FirstName. Each episode is based in turn on a chapter from the book, followed by a discussion of the very same chapter with an expert marketing practitioner in the following episode. As always, you can buy the book on Amazon or other bookstores. You can also choose to listen to it all for free on your favorite podcast service. You're also very welcome to download the abstract of the book for free, and all models, of course, are able to download. All downloads are sponsored by Agilic. I'll make sure to put a link to everything in the show notes. But you can always connect on LinkedIn, and I'll be happy to reply and help out. Hello, and welcome here to the Hello FirstName podcast / webinar. Thank you for listening to this, or even watching this if you are watching the video. Today we're going to talk about the definition of personalization. And to help me with that, I have here in the studio Tekila Harley Nobile. Thank you so much for joining us, Tekila.
Hello, and thank you for the invite.
Perhaps, instead of me introducing you, I think it'd be better perhaps if you introduce yourself and also a few words on the PhD that you've done on the topic of personalization.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So I'm a researcher and a lecturer in digital communication, digital marketing. I'm currently working as a lecturer in fashion business and a luxury business at Sotheby's Institute of Art in London. I've recently started, so only a couple of weeks. Previous to that, I was a research and PhD student in Schwitzerland at Università della Svizzera Italiana, where I conducted my PhD. And the topic of my PhD was on personalization in digital fashion communication. So that's where the interest in personalization for me started. My PhD was a process of trying to understand what personalization is. So again, from the definition, which we'll probably later discuss, up to understanding what is the value of personalization for the fashion industry. So should companies utilize it as a strategy, what kind of strategy it is, and to what point can it be useful, both from a consumer perspective and from an industry perspective.
And you handed in your thesis, I believe, the fall of 2022, as I recall.
Yes, correct. Yes, exactly. And I defended the PhD December, so just before Christmas, 2022.
So a nice Christmas present for yourself, I guess.
Exactly.
It must be a long-awaited Christmas holiday there.
Yes, that was amazing. But the process of researching personalization was extremely interesting. Also because there was an interest from the industry to communicate with me during the research, collecting data. So it was a very hot topic in the moment, and currently still is. So it was a good process.
Perhaps only overshadowed by generative AI at the moment. But I think I discussed that also with my fellow author, David Mannheim. And it actually fits together because obviously generative AI can be a huge contributor to personalization as well. So you have to put on here the don't disturb. We'll edit that out. All right, great. So can you tell us a bit about the thesis that you did and the study? A bit more in detail. What was it about? Where did you start? And what were the main issues that you encountered?
Yes. So I started from the literature review. So really by reading, trying to understand what was already published on the topic of personalization. And indeed, there was a extremely vast pool of studies that I could delve into and research. And from there, what I was able to identify was mainly issues. So indeed, there was a lot of conversation around the topic. However, I could not find general agreements around the topic. So indeed, starting firstly from what is personalization, I started then trying to speak with the industry experts to see what their viewpoint was on personalization. So was this disagreement just from an academic perspective or also within the industry? But I found that everyone was giving their own definition. So we started a first secondary research in order to put together all the elements that form personalization. So starting from what context is personalization delivered to, what kind of information is necessary, who are we delivering the personalization to, and what tools do we need to do this. Starting from this general base, I was then able to work on a definition. So to do this, I developed a Delphi study with what at the time was my supervisor, Professor Lorenzo Cantoni, and we sent out a survey, an online survey with the different questions, asking them what is personalization according to you, your expertise and your experience. From this, we were able to gain a definition. 100% agreement was reached, with obviously some different elements that did not reach the agreement. Mainly was around the terminology that we utilize when referring to personalization. So for example, customization. Are they synonyms? Are they the same thing? Are they different? To what extent are they different? So it was an interesting process because we did reach a definition, but with many different aspects to it that then can be applied depending, for example, on the sector in which we utilize it. So I was mainly focusing on the fashion sector. So in this case, the terminology of customization referring to being able to modify tangible product, whether it can be shoes, accessories, garments, was extremely important to them, because the contribution of the individual in deciding what color can my shoes be, can I change the sole, can I put my initials on them, was for them really important. So for this reason, in developing the definition, we kept in consideration all these different elements. And I think if I had to start defining personalization, the main words that I would use are dynamic process. Mm-hmm. So in the environment that we currently are and live in, with such a great influence from technology and how personalization is developed and provided to the end consumer, the process idea, so something that keeps evolving and changing in the way it is delivered to the end consumer, is important.
So really inspiring for me also as an author to have these conversations with you. So I think when I first stumbled upon your studies and some of the papers that you wrote, I think to begin with, I was delighted that someone shared the same frustration that I felt with the ambiguity and the sort of the implicit agreeing on what personalization is and isn't, where everybody seemed to agree, and they were fine with the definition being super plastic and very generic and meaning all kinds of things at the same time. And obviously that led to confusion and misunderstandings. And so I was glad to see that it wasn't only me who couldn't find heads and tails of this huge topic. And what I found, and also, which is why I believe one of the reasons that I found for there being so much confusion on the topic is that you'd have quite different marketers using the same term personalization, but working with fairly different things, really. So whether you're working with product recommendations, as you could be within fashion, you could be personalizing the product recommendations, obviously. But you could also be personalizing a welcome flow or an advert for that matter. So there are quite many ways of looking at personalization. So let's start out discussing some of the topics also that I decided to touch upon after having read the stuff that you wrote, to get us closer to the definition of personalization. There's definitely a good definition. I actually quoted your definition of personalization in my book. I found it a bit too wide, actually, but I think a definition of personalization kind of has to be wide because it needs to cover all these different ways of working with personalization, at least if you don't want to end up telling people that they're working with the wrong kind of personalization and it isn't kosher or it's the wrong way or they got it wrong or whatever. And I find that to be extremely hard if that's what they're getting their paycheck for and if it's on the invoices that they send out. So I think you and I both decided to not go that route where we point fingers at people and saying that they're doing personalization wrong, which is where we really agree. But coming back to personalization versus customization, can you say a bit about the distinction between the two, if there is a distinction and if there is a difference? I know for some there are.
Yes, so for those that in our survey say, for me, there is a difference, is the way it's conceptualized from a consumer perspective. So personalization is delivered from the company or the brand to the consumer, and it's the company that tries to collect as much data as possible in order to deliver a product or a service that is just for them. Whether that is a newsletter including the name, recommendation of products based on previous searches and so on. The difference with the customization is that there's a direct involvement of the consumer up to contributions in terms of co-designing something. So for example, if I go onto a website and me as a consumer, I'm deciding which elements I want to personalize for that specific product. So is it the color? Is it my initials on it? Is it the way it is presented? So really the co-designer is the main element. And again, this could be also because as a limitation to a certain extent of the study is that it is mainly for the fashion industry. So again, where these elements of the tangible products and the intangible products is extremely important, which might not be as relevant for other industries.
So actually my son, he customized a pair of sneakers for me as a birthday gift. I'm extremely happy with those. But so if I get this right, it would be say that Nike had decided based on data on me to suggest me a personalized pair of sneakers. That would be personalization because they're in the sending end of the communication, so to speak. Whereas when my son he's the customer, and when he's the one sort of making the choices and choosing the designs, that would be customization. So there's this correlation between customization and the word customer that I believe makes really good sense.
Yes.
I actually decided to weed that out in the definition that I chose to work with in the book, saying that customization, that is a customer-led process, and if we want to make things less if we want to kill the ambiguity, then we should decide to leave customization for something that the customer initiates. What would you say? So say that I go in as a customer and I go into a product category page, and I select certain filters, which will then ultimately display me a selection of the products that could be in this high category. Would you regard that as customization as well?
Yes, because I'm, as the customer, deciding what I want to see, for example, on that page, and I'm not receiving a recommendation directly from them. But I think obviously terminology is extremely important, and that's why we're working a lot on the definition. But when we consider personalization as an umbrella term, it's because it's then the ability to put all these elements together. So the most important thing, I think, at the end is that the consumer receives what they want. So whether we can define it as a customization, I'm selecting the filters, it's then maybe the ability of the company from their side to collect this data, and then the next time, for example, provide recommendations based on the filters or what was selected. So what I was trying to say at the beginning, this dynamic process really is this idea of trying to connect all the dots from the various perspectives, whether it's the user that starts it or whether it's the company that infers information. So seeing this as
you could have the customization process to start with, and that will inevitably lead to a lot of data collection, which could then turn into personalization. So the company, the brand would get to know me as a customer through my customization of the products that I want or the selections that I make. And thus that would enable them to actually personalize for me later.
Yes, exactly. We collected quite a lot of data regarding newsletters. So we decided to focus on that channel because we saw there was some interest from outside. So that's the channel that we decided to focus on to start with. And about 1,000 newsletters we subscribed to. So we inserted names, surnames, email address. Yes, the inbox was just for that, basically, just for that study. And in some cases, you had the opportunity to select maybe preferences, whether you're interested in women's, men's, kids, and so on. Mm-hmm. And interesting, some of these brands that were actually collecting this data, when we were receiving the confirmation email that we subscribed, were not including any of those elements. So, for example, if they're collecting and I'm providing them with my name and I'm agreeing to this, then it was interesting to see that in the welcome, it was just a general dear, for example, without maybe dear Tekila, which is what I expected to see. So I thought this was an interesting insight. So how much data we collecting and how much is actually being utilized.
I think that's part of the disappointment that consumers expect, because as consumers, I believe that's my belief, that we've seen what can be done with personalization from the likes of Amazon and Netflix and whatnot, and so we come to expect it. And if we believe that brands that we like, they're missing an opportunity to actually become more personal with us. If they're missing out on that, we feel slightly disappointed. Yes. Or it could be the other way, where we actually say that we're receiving something that's completely random, but because we are who we are and this fits extremely well with our preferences, although it's random, we perceive it as personalization. So you differ between, or you just have this distinction between actual versus perceived personalization. Maybe tell us a few words about that.
Yes. The reason that, let's say, this topic and discussion came out is because we started thinking we're all different. So every consumer has their needs, their preferences, the way that they like to shop, what they like to see. So how can we come to a definition of personalization when everyone is so individual? So for this reason, we create a distinction between the actual personalization, so what is actually delivered from the company to the end user. So for them, that's what personalization is, up to what is the user's perception on what has been, in this case, received. So for example, if we go back to the newsletter's name, if I put Dear Tekila, when I open the newsletter, for me, Tekila, it might be an element of personalization. So I might say, oh, that's very nice. They know who I am and they know my name. So I might think they're kind of personalizing the communication to me. Somewhere, maybe another person, for whatever reason, open the newsletter, see a dear and a name, and they might not actually think that is personalization. It could be because they receive lots of newsletters, maybe they're very accustomed to seeing it, so they just think it's something that is being done automatically from a machine, and it's not actually, yeah. So what we did is focus groups with the consumers, and we tried to reach an understanding of personalization, but in this case, from a consumer perspective. So what is personalization for the consumer? So indeed, the definition was more from an expert perspective, but then from the end users, we were still missing it. And indeed here, other elements emerge. So not all the elements that inserted can be perceived in the same way. And this is one, I think, of the main challenges of personalization, because it is so individual. And something that might be considered as personalization by someone could also have negative effects for someone else, because for them, receiving that kind of recommendation can be really annoying.
There's a whole notion of creepiness. So I took, or tried at least in the book, to take this distinction between actual versus perceived communication or personalization. And first of all, I think I see examples of, as I mentioned before, where people perceive something as personalized, even though it may not be at all. So retailer sends out a completely random advert, and some find it extremely spot on for their needs, and thus they believe it to be an act of personalization. I think it goes both ways, both that you get some kind of personalization, but you realize that it isn't really personalized because it's just first name, and we see that quite too often. So Hello FirstName, hence the title of the book. But I really took this into, I elaborated on this, and I made the distinction between implicit and explicit personalization. So coming back to the definition, I think it's pretty clear that we both define personalization as an umbrella term that actually covers quite a few tactics where the brand is just treating individuals differently and not the same. And I came up with this notion of implicit versus explicit personalization, that you can, as a brand, give people different treatments without them necessarily noticing it. So that could be either by choosing to not send them something that you'd otherwise send. So basically you'd be excluding people. So that's the most invisible form of implicit personalization. You're getting another treatment, but you don't notice because you'll be excluded from certain newsletters or communication, or things will not be visible in your version of the newsletter. Versus the explicit personalization, where we are as a brand very clear on why we're telling you what we're telling you, and thus make it completely transparent that we're showing you this because of this. So we're telling you something that's personalized, and we tell you why we tell you what we tell you, which is what I would call explicit personalization. Did you come across some of those discussions in your research as well?
Yes, in the literature it's widely discussed, and implicit personalization is highly connected to privacy issues when it's discussed and presented, because maybe in explicit personalization, somehow it can be clearer why I'm receiving it. So I'm receiving this recommendation because you've previously clicked on this product, or because you've previously searched for this page. So it can be easier to understand from a user perspective, a consumer. In implicit personalization, to what extent are we aware that personalization is taking place? So indeed, there's a whole privacy issues that they're massive when talk about personalization. We can't avoid thinking about them. And it's also an issue of awareness. So at this point, a lot of people are talking about personalization. The awareness indeed is increasing. However, what knowledge do we actually have? So what's happening in the background, and also some other risks. So for example, what is my choice? So am I selecting from a predefinite selected number of products by someone else, and I just see maybe these pages, these products, these services because they've been somehow filtered beforehand. But obviously I'm not aware that this is...
Exactly. And I think this comes down to, so I came across a lot of people. So I did this huge research process where I had I interviewed countless countless people for this, and then I had people from different ways of people who were working within different disciplines of marketing, and we were discussing the term. And some of them were of the belief that for personalization to be real, it had to be visible for the individual. It had to be explicit. So that, and I think exactly this what you're saying here. That say that you are going onto a website, you are browsing, maybe adding a few products to the basket. You're not logged in or anything. And then when you go to a product category page, the sorting or the ranking of the products would be different for you than for everybody else. And I believe that's the work of personalization engines. So that's literally the category tag on these software products, and telling them that they are not working with personalization, even though it isn't explicit for the end customer, or it's at least fairly hidden or obscure. I think that's a bit of a dangerous path to tread. We talk a bit about. This leads me into the talk about targeting. So if within advertising, I don't know if you were covering advertising in your studies, the notion of targeting, saying that we're running this ad and we're deciding to only show it to people who fill these criteria. That's normally referred to targeting. Would you characterize that as an act of personalization as well?
I wouldn't, because two reasons. One, coming from a communication perspective, so my studies, we don't really like to utilize the term targeting because it gives that one-way relationship.
Yeah.
Instead, we always think of a two-way communication between who's delivering the message, who's receiving the message, and then again this process, so a cycle of information that's carrying on between the two, rather than just trying to target someone and send that specific information. Again, it could be down to terminology and how this is then. Yes, exactly. The thing is that personalization, so there's something that's actually being changed to provide value. So obviously value to the consumer, and ideally in return value to actually providing their personalization, because it's a big investment to personalize. So does it actually provide value? So if it's yes, then it's personalization. If it's no, it's just a tactic that can be tested and tried, but maybe it's not the right one in that specific occasion or for that user, for example.
I would think advertisers would be doing this for the sake of creating value. So I mean, why else would they bother? So the whole selection of deciding whom to show the ad for would be strongly correlated with whom you'd expect to find this more relevant than just the average consumer out there.
Yes.
How about, so a lot of the I meet this quite often. I'm sure you came across this as well. So often I would hear people say, oh, that's not personalization. We're not working with personalization. We're just working with segmentation. And is that, so I consider it within the umbrella term of personalization. So it's just maybe a weak form of personalization. You can, of course, take it to the extent where you have a segment of one, and then maybe there's not so much different anymore. But how do you distinguish between the two?
I think if there's a segment as one, as you said, then that is personalization, because if I'm delivering something specific to that individual person, user, consumer, and that is my individual, why would that not be personalization if it's a segment of one? So indeed, definitions and how we refer terminology, if I have maybe a segment of 50 people, I'm just saying a random number, I could say this maybe is not personalization, because now with the tools, the technologies that we have, for sure, much more could be done. But then if I'm reaching a segment of one, I would probably refer to it as personalization.
Yeah. Yeah. So Ryan, that's actually why I came to the conclusion that, well, if a segment of one is personalization, then a segment of two is also personalization. And if I'm sending someone an email with the women's clothes, and that would be because I know that they're interested in women's clothes, that would be, again, some sort of, it's a segmentation clearly, but it's also an act of personalization because they're getting a treatment that someone else isn't getting, whereas I would probably be getting the men's clothes. And whether or not I decide to put in people's first name is, I mean, it's personalization regardless. It's not an either or, it's more like a range. How personalized is it? Where I would say that most segmentations aren't really personalized, but the more you do the explicit personalization, the more data you use, and the more individual the communication becomes, then higher degree of personalization it is. Especially the explicit part when it comes from the consumer point of view. So am I experiencing the personalization? Then it's most likely explicit, or I mean, it may go totally unnoticed and just be a very pleasant interaction, maybe without friction. I'll just sort of magically find that everything is super relevant for me, but I wouldn't necessarily know that I am being personalized heavily too.
Yes, in the definition, we have that the object is changing dimensions at a number of states. So again, if we want to take the same example of the newsletters, I can have many dimension and many elements in that newsletter that I can potentially personalize or not. So it could also be to what extent should, in this case, the newsletter be personalized? Is there a right number of elements or not? So I haven't actually touched this research yet, but I think in the future I would like to study this. So what is the balance? How many elements should be changed and in this case personalized? Or maybe we don't have a correct number of elements because for the end consumer, again, going back to the idea of perception, it's different. So we can't reach a specific. But I think when trying to understand with segmentation, the idea of something that's changing dimensions at a number of states can be useful to understand what am I actually modifying and what am I actually sending through.
We discussed also in the expert panels that I put together, we discussed the notion of timing. I mean, so that say that the content or the message was static, but the timing of which you as a retailer, for instance, decided to send this particular message to me, because that was on a very individual basis, then that would still be regarded. And there was people seem to agree on this, even though the message was basically the same. Get back to the basket because you seem to have forgotten some products there. Because the timing was individualized, we would count that as an act of personalization as well, even though the message was basically the same.
Yes. Yeah, the customer journey. So we did another study with a fashion company in email marketing, and we tried to divide their customers in different customer journey segments. So from the search on the website, they were searching for a product and then abandoned the website, up to a search and a stay on the product for a certain amount of seconds. So ideally I'm interested in that product, up to I've searched for the product, I've stayed on it, I've put it in the basket, but then I've left the basket and I haven't purchased. So we then sent newsletters to these three different segments to see timing, in this case considered as one over the customer journey phase. What was the response to it? And indeed, it changed a lot. So if we take the basket abandonment, the time at which the message was received was important. So just from a very simple timing, if I've just searched, put it in the basket, left, and I receive the reminder that I've left the element in the basket after an hour, it might be too soon. Okay, maybe I was at work and I've put it there. I don't want to be reminded so soon. Maybe 24 hours. Again, here many studies could be done, and some already working on this, on when should the message be received. So what is the correct time?
I think if you're ordering fast food online, maybe 10 minutes or 1 minute could be the right timing. Whereas if you're considering a really expensive fancy party dress, then maybe tomorrow will be a better time. Or
Yes, and I think also that's why personalization is such an interesting topic, because there are so many elements to it. So it's hard in a way to reach the perfect personalization because so many things have to be done when even just a simple message is sent out. And what am I considering when I'm personalizing? Is it the content? Is it when I'm sending it? We can also think of how is the person feeling in that moment. Maybe I like receiving recommendations. I've searched for black trousers and I like receiving products. But on that day, I'm just not feeling it and I just don't like recommendations. So again, how is it possible to understand the consumer's feeling in the moment that the message is received? So many elements that make personalization interesting.
So I'm under the belief that you can't understand what's going on in the customer. And I mean, the customer journey basically belongs to the customer. And whatever's going on in their lives, we only have fractions of info that can tell us stuff about that, but we never really know. There can be so many reasons for abandoning the basket. The dog barked, or the child cried, or I didn't want it anyway, or I have another tab open where I choose to buy it instead, so on and so on. So I think, that's my belief, at least, that at least for, of course, some customers you'll know better because they've been shopping with you many times, and maybe they have a subscription, and you're taking in all kinds of data sources into account when you are deciding what the next best experience is for each end customer. But basically, you don't know. It's guessing. It's about being less wrong, as I see it. All right. So, what do you think about the term hyper personalization? Is it the same as individualization, or and is it within? Can we get there soon, or?
Again, definition. Would I develop or try developing a new definition from personalization, hyper personalization?
Just seems to be coming up on vendor websites all the time.
Yes, yeah. So could hyper-personalization mean I can reach that specific individual in so many ways compared to I just have an idea of the profile, who he is and what he likes. In hyper-personalization, I have a lot of data, so I can build really a customer profile specific to him, and I can collect lots of data. And I think, again, it goes back to the beginning, this dynamic process. How do I reach hyper-personalization? Maybe one of the potential ways is collect the data and also utilizing it when I'm delivering it. Obviously, said this seems extremely simple. Putting it in practice is something completely different. So I don't want to just make the topic so simple, but again, rather than focusing so much on, the terminology, even though it is important, I think when we talk about hyper-personalization, and as I was saying, because now of all the different digital technological advances that we can see, the potential is just another level. So what could be done before, now we could do much more, I think. And for this reason, we talk about hyper-personalization. But the end goal, I would see it as the same.
I'm looking at some of the stuff that you can do with generative AI, and I'm sort of seeing so near future, as I see it, I believe that you could start crafting the messages. I mean, the product recommendations, we've been able to stitch those together using AI for a long time. But the messages, so where we put in the creativity and where we do the copywriting and where we draw the images and the videos and whatnot, to like the whole creative part of communication where we inject personalization. Normally that has been done at a segment level, and where you could, and I tried even briefing ChatGPT and Midjourney to make me images and text that would be the right one for a particular segment in a particular moment of truth in the customer journey, and that worked fairly well. But I could see a future where we don't brief the generative AI on a segment or a moment of truth, but we brief the generative AI with the full customer history of my interaction with brand X. So we have this customer, this is their all the data that we have on them, the full list of behavioral data and transactions and purchases and things they put on their wish list, the pages that they visited, and so on and so on. And we we provide that as one big brief, basically, or one big prompt to the generative AI, which would then have to figure out, okay, how do we make this customer happy and while hopefully getting them to make a purchase. And for me, at least, I think that could be where the one-to-one future. I remember Don Peppers and Martha Rogers writing the one-to-one future in 1993, and they saw this one-to-one future as MARFI, as marketing fiction, and where I think that maybe this is within reach now, but I think I, as a retailer, would still be wanting to supervise the output from that, so I wouldn't see any weird stuff going on, or weird messages being written, or weird images being put together. So maybe it's going to be like self-driving cars. I mean, they're almost here, but they're totally not.
Yes. Yeah, and ideally, we know what that customer wants before they know. So we know them so well that we can anticipate what they're going to want to buy and look for and purchase.
Or we'll be having to market it not to them, but to their personal AI assistant, who will then decide whether or not this is by the AI perceived as relevant enough to be presented for the end customer. All right, let's round it off at this. In the book, of course, you can see Tekila Harley Nobile's definition of personalization. You can also see the practitioner's definition that me and Franz and the other authors decided to put together to narrow it down just a bit for more a practical way of working with this. It may not be as academically correct, but at least it's something that sets the background, or it's the foundation for the bow tie of personalization, which is the main model of the book. So one last question, Tekila, and I didn't ask you to prepare this. So what is your favorite experience with a brand where you really felt you got a personalized treatment?
So my favorite one, again, coming from a communication perspective and probably the way also I'm used to navigating, is the way when I'm searching for something new and the way the product is actually presented to me. So I feel like I've actually searched for that product before I then landed on the specific page. And I think this for me is something that's extremely useful. So as a consumer, I purchase a lot online, and when I manage to do this and I feel, oh yes, that product is for me, I think is the best that I've seen at this point amongst the many personalization, obviously, strategies that can be implemented.
Right. Thank you very much for taking the time to discuss this with me. A pleasure, as always, to discuss this wonderful topic with you. So I think without any further ado, this is the end of the episode. And remember that you can, dear listeners, viewers, that you can download all the models from the book. We'll be releasing a chapter at a time and discussing it with experts from within the field. You can download the model, you can download an abstract of the book, or you can just stay tuned to the podcast channel, and the remaining chapters will pop up one by one, week after week. So thank you for joining.
Thank you very much for the invite and for sharing the interesting topic with me.
Thank you for listening in on this episode of Hello FirstName. Remember that all models and even a written abstract of the book are available for download. You'll find the link in the show notes. In our next episode, we'll cover Chapter 4, which is about why personalization works and the psychological aspects behind it.